For decades, we've been told a story of global cooperation, a story of world leaders gathering under one banner to shield humanity from a climate crisis. From the Rio Earth Summit to the landmark Paris Agreement, a narrative of collective ambition was carefully crafted. But today, an era of promises on a planet in peril has given way to a sobering reality check. Those pledges are now on trial, not in a court of law, but in the court of planetary survival. And the verdict is clear. The gap between promises made and actions taken is a chasm. Despite countless summits, global greenhouse gas emissions continue to climb. A decade after the Paris Agreement set a goal to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we are perilously off course. The UN's 2025 Emissions Gap Report paints a stark picture. Even if every single pledge is met, we're on track for a 2.3 to 2.5 degree temperature rise this century. Under current policies, that figure becomes a catastrophic 2.8 degrees. The science is unequivocal. Every fraction of a degree matters, and the window to avert the worst is closing with terrifying speed. Today, we're going to explore why. This is the story of a collective failure woven into our global economy, our politics, and the deep-seated inequities that divide our world. At the heart of the modern climate regime is the 2015 Paris Agreement. It was hailed as a diplomatic triumph. Instead of a rigid top-down model like the old Kyoto Protocol, it uses a bottom-up approach. Each country determines its own climate targets, known as Nationally Determined Contributions or NDCs. They have to prepare them, report on their progress, and update them every 5 years with higher ambition. It's a system designed for universal participation. But here's the critical design feature, or flaw. The achievement of those targets is not legally binding. There is no global climate police, no enforcement mechanism to compel a nation to cut its emissions. The system relies on peer pressure and transparency, a name and encourage approach. While this got every nation to sign on, it has created a framework where ambition often exists only on paper. This weakness is compounded by the fact that the pledges themselves are simply not enough. The first global stocktake, a comprehensive progress report released in 2023, delivered a blunt warning. The world is not on track. To have a shot at a 1.5 degree future, global emissions need to be slashed by a staggering 55% by 2035. The latest round of NDCs submitted by 2025 has, in the words of the UN, barely moved the needle. The gap between what is promised and what is needed remains dangerously wide. At the core of this failure lies a deep division, centered on a principle called common but differentiated responsibilities. This acknowledges that while climate change is a shared problem, not all nations bear equal responsibility for creating it, nor do they all have the capacity to fix it. This principle of climate justice has become a major fault line in global negotiations. Let's start with the developed nations. Countries in North America and Europe grew their economies for over a century by burning fossil fuels, accumulating a massive carbon debt. They're responsible for the largest share of historical emissions, and so they are expected to lead. But their performance has been a mixed bag. A 2024 study of pledges made back in 2009 found that numerous developed countries, including Australia, Canada, and Japan, failed to even meet their 2020 targets. Take the United States, the world's largest cumulative emitter. U.S. climate policy is a story of political whiplash. We saw the Biden administration pass the landmark Inflation Reduction Act to supercharge clean energy investment. This was followed by the Trump administration in 2025, which had previously initiated withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and moved to dismantle climate regulations. This deep partisan divide makes long-term, consistent policy almost impossible to sustain. Then there's the European Union, which has positioned itself as a global climate leader. Its European Green Deal aims for a 55% emissions cut by 2030 and climate neutrality by 2050, and it has made progress. But it's facing its own challenges. A 2025 study of the Green Deal's 154 targets found that while some were on track, many needed acceleration, and some were even regressing. After the 2024 European parliamentary elections, which saw gains for center-right and populist parties, the Green Deal came under fire. A narrative is growing that the EU's green ambitions are putting it at a competitive disadvantage, leading to a potential weakening of its goals. For developing nations, the challenge is a complex trilemma: how to lift millions out of poverty, grow their economies, and adapt to a crisis they did little to create, all without locking in a high-carbon future. China, as the world's largest current emitter, is pivotal. The country has made absolutely massive investments in renewables. Its solar and wind capacity is expanding at an unprecedented rate, and its emissions could peak years ahead of its 2030 target. However, China remains heavily reliant on coal for energy security. It's walking a tightrope, positioning itself as a leader of the developing world, while its sheer scale of emissions places it in a category of its own. India faces a monumental task. With a rapidly growing population and economy, its energy demand is set to soar. The country has ambitious renewable energy targets, but struggles with an aging electricity grid and a heavy dependence on imports for solar panels and batteries. The transition is complicated by the need to provide affordable energy to millions and manage a, quote, just transition for communities dependent on the coal industry. India consistently argues that without adequate and predictable international finance and technology, it cannot be expected to sacrifice its development for a problem it did not historically create. And then there are the small island developing states, or SIDS. For these 39 nations, climate change is not a future problem. It is an existential threat happening right now. Their populations and infrastructure are concentrated along coastlines, making them acutely vulnerable to rising sea levels that threaten to submerge entire islands. From 1970 to 2020, SIDS lost an estimated $153 billion due to extreme weather, a colossal sum for their small economies. Despite contributing less than 1% of global emissions, SIDS have become powerful, moral and political leaders. They consistently advocate for the most ambitious targets, championing the 1.5-degree goal. Their most urgent demand is for finance, not just for cutting emissions, but for loss and damage, compensation for the irreversible impacts they are already suffering. The establishment of a loss and damage fund at COP27 was a landmark victory, but for these nations, climate pledges are a lifeline that is rapidly fraying. This brings us to the trillion-dollar question: climate finance. Ambitious plans are meaningless without money. In 2009, developed countries pledged to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020 to help developing nations. This target was not only missed, but it has become a symbol of broken promises. When the goal was finally reported as met, the accounting was heavily disputed, with much of the finance coming as loans, not grants, adding to crippling debt burdens. And the scale of the need dwarfs the pledges. Developing economies need upwards of $2 trillion annually. The new climate finance goal being negotiated for COP30 looks towards mobilizing at least $1.3 trillion per year. But the financial gap is stark. There is an annual shortfall of around $400 billion just to triple renewable energy capacity. Meanwhile, global fossil fuel subsidies still amount to roughly $1 trillion each year. Governments are spending vast sums to fuel the very crisis they've pledged to solve. And there's a profound, clean energy divide. Advanced economies in China receive the lion's share of investment, while the rest of the developing world, home to 2/3 of humanity, receives only about 15%. The transition to a net-zero world is also a technological transformation. While the falling cost of solar and wind power shows what's possible, significant roadblocks remain. Take carbon capture, utilization and storage, or CCUS. This is a set of technologies that aims to capture CO2 from industrial sources or directly from the air. It's often presented as a solution for hard-to-abate sectors like cement and steel. But CCUS is incredibly expensive, ranging from $40 to $600 per ton of CO2, and it's energy-intensive. A power plant with CCUS might need to burn 25% more fuel just to generate the same amount of power. After decades of research, global capture capacity is a tiny fraction of our annual emissions. Critics argue it's just a lifeline for the fossil fuel industry, a moral hazard that delays the real work of phasing out coal, oil, and gas. Another promising technology is green hydrogen, produced by splitting water with renewable electricity. It could be a clean fuel for shipping, aviation, and heavy industry. But it's currently 2 to 3 times more expensive than hydrogen made from fossil fuels and requires a massive build-out of new infrastructure. Beyond specific technologies, the process of technology transfer, moving innovations from developed to developing countries, is blocked by high costs and restrictive intellectual property rights. And the world faces a colossal renewable energy infrastructure gap. The International Energy Agency estimates that annual investment in power grids must double by 2030. We could be facing a $15 trillion infrastructure gap by 2040. Ultimately, the failure to uphold climate pledges is not just technical or financial, it is political. For decades, the fossil fuel industry has run a sophisticated, well-funded campaign to delay climate action. This includes direct lobbying, funding disinformation to sow public doubt, and using trade associations to oppose climate policies. Major oil and gas companies spend hundreds of millions annually on these efforts. At COP27, for example, over 600 fossil fuel lobbyists were registered attendees, a delegation larger than that of most countries. They publicly support the Paris Agreement, while their business plans often prepare for a world with far more warming. In many countries, climate has also become a deeply divisive political issue. In the United States, climate policy is often a casualty of the culture wars, making stable, long-term legislation nearly impossible. And while polls show broad public concern about climate change, that support can weaken when it comes to specific policies that impose direct costs, like carbon taxes. Politicians, fearing a public backlash, often shy away from the bold action required. But as political and diplomatic avenues falter, a new front has opened: the courtroom. A growing wave of climate litigation is seeing citizens and activists sue corporations and governments for their failure to act, framing inaction not as a policy failure, but as a violation of fundamental human rights. One of the most significant legal victories was the Urgenda Foundation versus the State of the Netherlands. In 2015, a Dutch court ordered the government to cut its emissions by at least 25% by 2020. The court found that the government had a legal duty of care to protect its citizens from climate change, grounding its decision in the human right to life. The Dutch Supreme Court upheld this ruling, affirming that courts can order governments to comply with their obligations. In the U.S., the Juliana versus United States case saw a group of young plaintiffs sue the federal government, arguing that its promotion of fossil fuels violated their constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property. These cases represent a paradigm shift, moving the conversation from voluntary pledges to legal obligations. 10 years after the Paris Agreement, the world is at a perilous crossroads. The machinery of global climate diplomacy has created a framework and spurred progress, but its core mission, to bend the emissions curve downwards at the speed required by science, is failing. The pledges on the table are being judged against the harsh reality of a warming planet. The evidence is mounting. The gap between ambition and action is vast. The chasm in finance remains unbridged, and the forces of political inertia are powerful. Yet despair is not a strategy. The surge in clean energy investment, the falling costs of technology, and the rise of citizen-led legal challenges show that change is possible. The path forward requires a radical acceleration of effort on all fronts. It demands that developed nations honor their financial and historical obligations, and that the fossil fuel industry's outsized influence is brought to an end. The trial of climate pledges is ongoing. It is a trial being conducted not by judges in robes, but by scientists with data, by activists in the streets, by communities on the front lines of disaster, and by future generations who will inherit the consequences of today's decisions. The world has made its promises. Now it is struggling to keep them, and time is running out.